Okay, I think we will start. Welcome everybody, both here in the room and also on the live stream, to this seminar on Nordic immigration policies in flux, domino effects and shifting paradigms. My name is Ida Marie Vammen. I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS, at the Department for Migration and Global Order, and I have organized this event together with Thomas here in the middle, Gammeltoft Hansen, in collaboration also with the Nordic Institute for Migration and the Center of Excellence for Global Mobility Law at University of Copenhagen. So for the next 2 hours or so, a little bit less, we will discuss the drivers of recent policy change in the Nordic countries, their impact and interlinkages also, of course, to the EU and other urgent situations, such as we just discussed this over lunch, such as the invasion of Ukraine and how that also shapes Nordic policy, immigration policies, and then also look, of course, at future challenges. The question of how the Nordic countries and the EU are handling and will handle migrants and refugees coming to Europe remains really this hot potato, both in national but evidently also in the current debates around the upcoming European Parliament elections. And we currently see the Danish government continues to push for more outsourcing of migration control and joint European cooperation with so-called third countries to handle migrants and asylum seekers coming to Europe. Most recently, I think many of you have probably seen this letter. We saw this joint letter to the European Commission proposing that what they call several new solutions to the migration problem. And there we saw Denmark and Finland co-signing with some of the European hardliners, such as Italy, Austria, Poland, and Bulgaria. And we can maybe discuss why was Sweden and Norway not there. To inform our discussion today, we have the stellar lineup of Nordic colleagues who I also really warmly want to welcome. We have research director sitting there drinking coffee from the Institute for Social Research in Norway, Jan Paul Brekke, who works on how Nordic policies are developed and their impact on the individuals who arrive. We also have Professor Jens Vedsted Hansen from Aarhus University, Department of Law, a leading Danish and international scholar of international refugee law and European asylum and immigration law. We have Saila Heini Koski, and that's always a difficult one for Danish people wanting to pronounce Finnish names, who is a senior research fellow at the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, and her research focuses on EU border management, free movement, and EU external relations and European integration. And we have Martin Nyman from Sweden, who is a senior legal advisor at the Civil Rights Defenders, where he leads their migration program, and previously he has held several positions within the field of migration law. And then, of course, you, Thomas, but you can maybe introduce yourself in a moment. Then we will have this roundtable discussion. We thought that was a more engaging event on a Friday, and for the next hour or so, my Nordic colleagues will discuss, and afterwards we also will open up and you will be able to ask questions and give comments. But once again, thank you so much for coming.
Yep. Thanks so much, Ida, for the nice introduction. My name, as said, is Thomas Gammeltoft Hansen. I used to work here, so in that sense, it was also a very natural thing for me to reach out and ask Ida and the migration section headed by Hans over here that could we do something together in terms of bridging these things? My day-to-day job is working at the University of Copenhagen now, but I also have the pleasure of chairing at the moment the so-called Nordic Institute for Migration, which is a non-physical institute of like-minded scholars across Nordic countries, of which some of the board members are sitting here. And so we've had the tradition over the last couple of years to try and do more Nordic cooperation, try and kind of get a sense also that can maybe shake up a little bit sort of national narratives in terms of how we see the major trends and sort of the internal looking things in terms of also kind of looking a little bit more to our neighbors. You could say it's maybe also a nudge for more Nordic cooperation in this area, and we'll be talking about whether this is actually happening in practice. You can say for me the backdrop for this particular seminar is a project we did a few years ago, and for which I think Seiler contributed, Jens contributed also, and it was a special issue co-edited with Sarah Scott Ford sitting down here also, which was titled Nordic Visions of International Migration and Refugee Law, which also from a different perspective brought to light this idea is there still a kind of Nordic shared vision? Is there still a Nordic stamp or something uniquely Nordic about the way we think about asylum and immigration policy? The premise for that, of course, has been that this was traditionally seen to be the case. Yeah, so all the Nordic countries in different ways have been historically labeled as liberal frontrunners in this area, but at the same time, as Ida also points in, we've seen very distinct shifts in this area. So in order to not bore you on a Friday afternoon with 5 or 4 lengthy paper presentations, we tried to do something that in Danish would be called a benspænd. I'm not sure how you translate that word. No, a basement. Yeah, okay. It doesn't translate. But the point being that we've asked each of our panelists to begin by really keeping their opening remarks quite short. So we'll hear from each of the countries in turn, 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll have a bit more of an engaging cross-cutting debate that sort of picks up on different types of themes. I'll try my best to moderate that, and of course very much welcome questions and interventions from the floor as well. But I'll begin by immediately handing over the floor to our first panelist, which is Jan Paul Brekke.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to come here to share a few thoughts on the Nordic cooperation and the Nordic alignment and the Nordic divergence in the field of asylum and migration policies. I followed the field since the 1990s and the arrival of Bosnian refugees, situation in some ways similar to what we're seeing now with the Ukrainian refugees and their temporary protection and on collective grounds. And I did that together with Jens as well. And that was a Nordic project, a very successful cooperation. When I got the email asking me to come here, I was reminded of a report I wrote in 2004, and it's called The Struggle for Control. And I think that kind of marks if you take the perspective of our governments in Nordic countries and they look at migration management, that's the thought they actually have in their mind. That's their mantra, their struggle for control. And it's not an easy struggle, and it has lots of aspects, and as I was mentioned here earlier, we are also into understanding how it's perceived and experienced. But I think the struggle for control is a good way of expressing what they want to achieve and what is difficult to achieve, and difficult to align at the same time as you respect human rights, refugees' rights, international rights. So it's control on one side and then rights on the other. And I see our governments trying to struggle with this and align the two, and the weight is on different feet, sometimes heavy on control, sometimes more on the side of humanitarian rights, refugee rights, integration measures, etc. So if you look back at that time, that was just after Denmark had, because if you look at the 4 countries, we were quite aligned until 2001, when Denmark kind of shot off in a more restrictive direction. And it seems like it's a far away, it's a long time ago, but still, I think that kind of set the direction with regard to the alignment of the countries. Restrictions that was the first paradigm shift. I could almost call it a paradigm shift in a way, because it was a new acceptance of restrictive measures and a step away from the solely humanitarian-based way of thinking about migration management. and asylum management in particular. So, but then Norway followed very quickly after that, and Sweden. But Sweden held back for a long time until 2015, and the migration or refugee crisis occurred, which was a game changer, definitely elicited the paradigm shift, and then later paradigm shift also in Sweden. So it's been, and in Finland as well. I mean, it was a shock for everyone. And what I've labeled the period after 2015 in our countries with regard to migration policy as the post-panic period. Because if you have the struggle for control as the goal, and then you see if that was the goal of the governments, and then you have the lack of control in 2015, that's exactly what our ministries of justice or ministries of interiors fear the most. The lack of control. That's their mandate, to have control, and when they don't have control, they don't fulfill their mandate, and it shocks the system, which means that a lot of the measures that were introduced, for example, in Norway, they were almost completely arbitrary, because they were all trying to push buttons to regain control, regardless of all the normal procedures and all the legal, looking into all the consequences, etc. It was a period of panic. Now then we have the post-panic period, trying to sort out bureaucracies, trying to sort out all the legal consequences, all these crazy measures made in the heat of the moment and during the fall of 2015. That was the situation in Norway. And then it's been very interesting to see the resistance in Sweden. We can come back to that, and the change with the new government, and also in Finland, which it's a major. It's a major, change that's been going on in both countries, and most recently in Finland, and I mean it's ongoing in Sweden. It's ongoing in both countries, I guess, and then fueled by the situation in the Ukraine and the bordering with Russia. So what about? And I just wanted to say that I think that in addition to this mantra of the struggle for control, it's also interesting, I think, and important to have, if it elicits, the struggle for control elicits a set of deterrence measures. So the logic of deterrence is trying to signal or to make measures that keep people from coming. The logic of deterrence is the logic kind of underlying a lot of the measures you see, and the political left are always very, critical of this, but if you see it in the logic of trying to maintain control and trying to obtain deterrence, that's the logic you have to understand it. And then against that, you have a whole paradigm of humanitarian principles and refugee rights. And that it gives a lot of strange. I mean, a lot of the cases you read about in the papers, where families are sent, against their will to lots of tough return cases, etc., revocation, cessation, where people lose their rights to stay in the country, or they lose after 20 years, and children speak Danish or Swedish or Norwegian, and they're kind of super good citizens. Still, their permits are revoked because they've been cheating or not, or they are losing their resident permits because their home country is seen as safe after 2, 3, 4 years in the country. So all these kind of extreme measures must be seen in that logic of control and deterrence. And then in Norway, it's interesting now, because I think we see some of that in these countries as well. In Norway, we received more than 80,000 Ukrainian refugees, and we're 5-point-something million people. So it's a major addition to our country. It's more than 1.5% of our that have been added to the country within a short time period, but that is that's still a separate. It has a separate special politics because they get temporary protection, but also anyway in the attitude, in the understanding of the public, it's separate from the deterrence policies against the asylum policies, the traditional way of trying to limit the number of arrivals through the asylum system. So you have like a continued effort to keep deterring, keep pushing for return of rejected asylum seekers, while at the same time showing almost maximum solidarity towards the Ukrainian refugees. And that's in a discussion we can pick up the internal things. So to finish off, just wanted to say that if I was to describe the current paradigm, both in Norway and maybe in the Nordics, it's marked by an increased attention to return, and that goes for the EU as well, which you should follow very closely, because it's very ambitious and very challenging in all ways, and it brings in these two, the struggle for control and the humanitarian rights. It puts it's a focal point for that conflict. So it's very interesting to follow, I think, from an academic perspective, but also from a humanitarian perspective. So more emphasis is put on return, and that will be as and the continuous challenge, I think, and that we should follow closely. And then externalization of borders. We all know this, how this works throughout, the neighboring countries taking part in the migration control to Europe. And then third country processing, like you have been discussing, of course, with Rwanda, both here and the UK, but also Denmark, taking initiative on a broader European scale. And finally, I think that I would just put in introductory comments there, just point to the nexus, the connection between migration control and integration. Because as part of this, when integration fails or integration is challenging, the diverse societies has lots of challenges, of course. This can push for a stricter, there's an interaction between that and a stricter regulation of migration and asylum. And then the other way, you can also argue the other way around, that stricter regulation, stigmatization of certain groups, countries, or regions, etc., or will affect and hinder integration. But we're seeing that in lots of different ways, and then and one way it's used is that you instrumentalize integration measures in order to deter. So you make integration more difficult because because you want to deter people from coming from maybe the same country, region, or group, or conflict, etc. And that is also something we think we should discuss, and we see in different varieties in the countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should get my mic on again. And I think we'll just immediately kind of continue this initial round. So next up, Saila, the perspective from Finland.
Yes, thank you. That was a really good background on to the paradigm shift that is currently going on in Finland. I think this is perhaps the largest shift we've seen in the Finnish migration policy, and I think it has been much inspired by the other Nordic countries, and even the government program says that the government will bring Finland's key asylum policy statutes up to the general level of Nordic countries. So the government seems to assume that there is this like a Nordic asylum policy, and Finland will now come to the same level as the other Nordic countries. There's also a direct reference to the Danish approach to revoking a citizenship if a person is involved in terrorism, and so there is, I think, even explicit like inspiration from the other Nordic countries in the current Finnish migration policy, and I think especially the Swedish and the Danish policy, the Swedish government program and the Danish policies that we heard were already like much earlier implemented than in other Nordic countries. And we also heard about the instrumentalization, which I think is common to Finland and Norway. So Finland and Norway both experienced that in 2015-16, and now last autumn at the Finnish eastern border. I think that has been the like major change now during the current government term, that the government has had to come up with new measures to this. So you probably know the border is now closed, but in addition to that, the government also issued this bill now in May on like stop processing the asylum applications or receiving asylum applications at the border. But it is currently in the parliament, and we'll see how the constitutional committee will react to that. And there is obviously a lot of discussion, and the bill itself admits that this is in tension with the international obligations of Finland, but this is something that the government is pushing. And I think more emphasis is also put on the EU migration policy. Now we have the pact concluded, but there is like more focus on this external dimension. So we have the government published its EU policy priorities this year, and they have this externalization of migration in that. So as we have the letter led by Danish that was also signed by Finland, and I think that will be very much discussed in the following commission's term. So I think there is a paradigm shift in Finland with regards to the Nordic countries, but also with regards to the EU, that there is taking a more active position and also pushing with other Nordic countries towards this stricter EU migration policy. And for example, for an EU mechanism that would allow stop processing the asylum application in case of instrumentalization. So that is also one explicit aim in the government paper. But perhaps I can stop here and let others continue from this.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sila. And we now move on to the third country perspective. Martin, Sweden.
Thank you. Yeah, Sweden. As we've already heard, the immigration policies have shifted in Sweden as well, and two clear turning points can be identified for when this happened. The first one was following the 2015 situation, the so-called refugee crisis, during this period in the autumn of 2015, the political response shifted very rapidly from the Prime Minister stating in September that my Europe does not build walls and being very welcome to the refugees, to expressing on a notorious press conference in November that Sweden needed breathing space in its refugee reception, and announcing a number of restrictions being introduced, and that they would also enter into force retroactively and be enforced from that press conference, which was a new way of dealing with legislation. The second turning point was the general elections in 2022, when an agreement called the TIDO agreement was entered into by the parties in the government, together with the far-right Sweden Democrats. And the biggest part in this agreement, about 1/3 of it, is on immigration and integration. Some of the goals that are being expressed in this agreement, one is to create a paradigm shift in the view of asylum reception. Protection should be offered temporarily, and for those fleeing Sweden's nearby area. It's also a lot of focus to deal with the so-called shadow society, and there we have the return focus, which is very much in focus in Sweden now, and the policies being developed. And also the agreement states it proposes to adapt Swedish asylum legislation to the minimum level required by EU law, and it explicitly states aiming at reducing asylum seekers' rights as far as is legally possible. And this is clearly a very different attitude from what was previously the case in Sweden. I believe that Sweden has definitely been inspired by other Nordic countries, and without being an expert on Danish policies, some of the policies initiated by the current government, as well as the narrative around them, have been strongly inspired by the Danish policies. And the government talking about the paradigm shift on immigration and the focus on protection being temporary has several similarities to Denmark's own paradigm shift in 2019. Also last spring, the Swedish Prime Minister was here for an inspirational trip to look at Danish immigration policies and expressing that Sweden has a lot to learn from Denmark and that we are 10 to 15 years behind you. Perhaps, I mean, going back to 2001, we are, well, even more behind than that in that sense. Yeah, these changes have not come around without being challenged from different parts in society. The changes in 2015, there was a lot of political agreement regarding the introduction of those rules at the time. Shortly before the vote in Parliament on this temporary law that was adopted, I met with about 10 members of Parliament, and they all expressed that this is nothing that we want to do, but we have to for the integrity of the reception system. But there was general consensus that this is not what we want to do. This can have bad effects on integration when it comes to temporary residence permits and restrictions in family reunification, for example. But this is only temporary, and then we will go back to normal. Then I had a follow-up meeting with them 2 years later, and the tone was completely different. It was basically consensus that no way that we can go back to the way it was before. And then the temporary law was extended for another 2 years, and then it was many parts made permanent after that. Yeah, and currently the measures that are being introduced now, there is actually not all that much political opposition to the changes. From civil society, the criticism has been more vocal, and especially regarding some of the proposals, such as a proposal to introduce an obligation for public civil servants to report people who they suspect might be in the country without a permit. This has faced strong reactions from civil society, stating that these measures impede people's access to fundamental rights and risk being counterproductive by pushing people even further away from society, and also undermining general trust in public authorities. And it has also faced criticism from trade unions, expressing that this is not anything that their members want to do, and that it goes against their work ethics. Yeah, maybe I should stop there for the introduction. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin. And then for our final panelist, Jens, you're Denmark.
I'm Denmark,
Yes.
or at least I'll say a few words about Denmark. I'll set out with the unsurprising distinction between ordinary migration and asylum, and just say a few words about ordinary migration. I both agree, and perhaps not fully, with what Jan Paul said about the paradigm shift in Denmark in 2001-2. In fact, I would say that as regards family migration, family unification, the significant restrictions introduced in 2002 and onwards were a kind of continuation of tendencies that had started already in the late 90s, maybe even the mid 90s, but in particular in the late 90s. But certainly they were intensified. And a lot could be said about the both legislative and judicial ways of accommodating or evading international obligations in that context. I won't do that, but you can read my article in that special issue, where I tried to account for that as I kind of saw it about 3 years ago, I think, or 2.5 years ago. I think basically it boils down to certain EU barriers, that is, limits based on EU law, which some of them were foreseen, some were not. The fact that restrictions of family reunification rights could be evaded by applying EU free movement rights. Danish citizens moving to another member state and settling for a period of time and then returning, often referred to as the Malmö model or the Flensburg model, because it often, of course, has been, or to some extent, has been applied just cross-border in cross-border situations. As we have seen also between Netherlands and Belgium, where there were kind of the same the same tendencies or disparities. Also, maybe a bit less foreseen, has actually been a number of cases from the EU Court of Justice concerning the EU-Turkey Association Agreement, which seemed to, due to a specific standstill clause, which does cover Denmark despite our general opt-out from immigration harmonization in the EU. But this is old EC law. So this standstill clause actually has turned out to also limit, to a certain extent, our possibilities to restrict family reunification rights for Turkish persons living here who are economically active. And there have been some quite spectacular rulings actually from the Luxembourg court in this regard, at least two, one in 2019 and one in 2022. The European Human Rights Convention has also shown to be a kind of limit, but I would say only to a very modest extent, for various reasons. It has been a consistent narrative from the Danish government that these restrictions were meant to uphold international obligations. I mean, as I said, some of the EU obligations were not really taken into account initially. And the European Convention on Human Rights appeared not to be very much of a restriction to what we did. Within ordinary migration, it should also be mentioned that we have actually also liberalized or made access to Denmark more open. A former director of the Danish Immigration Service once explained it in the way that actually already in 2002 we got a kind of new narrative, in the sense that the idea was to continue restricting access to family reunification, but to liberalize or lapse access to labor migration into Denmark. And that we have seen to an enormous extent. In many areas of Copenhagen in particular, it's impossible to buy a piece of bread or to order anything in a restaurant by speaking Danish. Why? I mean, some of those people are, of course, EU migrant workers, but many are not. So we have seen a really significant increase in labor migration into Denmark. Now, I'll turn to asylum. And here I think we have seen various and partly contradictory tendencies. And these also illustrate some of the Danish-Nordic cooperation. I do agree that we have seen more systematic exchanges in the recent years, and also parallel developments indeed since 2015, and for Sweden and Finland more recently due to domestic policy reasons in those countries. I think when it comes to asylum, there were more ad hoc inspirations previously. I can think of two pieces of legislation introduced in Denmark, which I think were sort of referring to certain Norwegian initiatives or cooperation with Norway. One was about unaccompanied minor asylum seekers, I think back in 2010-11. I think there was a Danish, Nordic, and maybe Dutch initiative there, which never really succeeded, but restrictions were adopted anyway. And secondly, there was a very, very specific legislation adopted, I think 2017 or 18, concerning fraud committed by asylum seekers by giving false identity information. I think that was explicitly inspired by Norwegian legislation, if I remember well. So that was more ad hoc inspiration. But if we go back to Denmark, I think it is fair to say that there have been contradictory tendencies in asylum law and policy. One of my impressions of this is a quite personal one. I became a member of the Danish Refugee Appeals Board in 2013, after having been out, so to say, for 19 years or so. I was there from 1987 until 1994, and then I came back again in 2013. And I would say that the general approach to international refugee law and human rights law was different in 2013. I think there was a much stronger awareness. It was a new generation of members, not least among the judges chairing the board. So I think there was a kind of not radical shift, but at least a change of at least the rhetoric, and sometimes also perhaps the substance of decisions. We have also seen certain types of asylum cases being decided markedly differently in the 2010s as compared to the 90s. In the 90s, it was plainly impossible for deserters or draft evaders to get asylum, at least with recognized refugee status. Since 2011, it has been mainstream for Syrian draft evaders to be granted or recognized as convention refugees, which is clearly a shift in approach to such cases. There have been certain modifications, I would say. There are certain pieces of or elements of asylum decisions where I would modestly argue that the appeals board has not been so loyal to international law obligations, partly because they felt to be mandated by the legislature not to be so. And this then touches upon what one could consider Danish exceptionalism through legislative changes. I'll point at two. One is the tendency towards the return focus or temporariness of protection, which was formally introduced with what was termed the paradigm shift in 2019, but which was in fact initiated already with legislation in 2015. And interestingly, early in 2015, it was proposed in November 2014. There was already by then the increasing arrivals of Syrian asylum seekers, which was simply triggering the idea to introduce this temporary protection status, which had certain similarities or parallels to what was introduced in Sweden, in particular, I think, later in 2015, with temporary protection only and limited rights, in particular, as regards family unification. And then the final paradigm shift, which sort of somehow reinforced the 2015 legislation, was introduced in 2019, which has seen quite interesting tendencies, I would say, in the practices both of the Immigration Service and of the Danish Refugee Appeals Board. It has been quite popular to criticize the Immigration Service. I tend to rather criticize the Appeals Board, because the Immigration Service cannot be expected to do anything quite different from what the government sort of mandates it to do. And they were simply awaiting clearer signals and consistent practice from the Appeals Board, which was not always evident. The second tendency of Danish exceptionalism is, of course, and that's my final point here, is, of course, the plans to outsource asylum, both in terms of procedures and eventual protection, which were all, these plans were all beginning with the Rwanda plans in 2021. I mean, it dates back to the Social Democratic Party program adopted in 2018. But then when the Social Democratic Party went into government power, they started implementing these plans with certain memoranda of understanding with Rwanda, but actually they never succeed, or Denmark never succeeded as well as UK did, because we never got a clear outsourcing agreement. There were tendencies and attempts, but then we had a new government late 22, which seemed to go for another strategy here. So it's hard to say what will happen. I mean, the government was in itself already in the 21 legislation aware that these outsourcing plans might cause problems with EU cooperation. Again, we have the opt-out, but we are part of the Dublin system, and I'm fairly sure that under the current, a little bit still current Dublin system, it would be impossible for Denmark to implement these outsourcing plans. The government had shifting signals. I think they were aware of the problem, but were trying to evade them. Anyway, they gave up the unilateral outsourcing plans with the new government in 22, and instead said they would go for some kind of EU solution here, which was at the time, perhaps by many observers, considered a bit sort of a kind of maybe some excuses for giving up the plans, maybe. But more recently, we have actually seen that Denmark now seems to be taking the lead in this connection. And of course, the outcome of the reforms of the common European asylum system have been an important factor in this. Again, it's interesting because Denmark is out of this, but we are sort of also a part of it. And it is, I think it has been stated clearly by at least one Danish official in an international setting. I wasn't there, but I have rumors from a reliable source that this person was stating in this meeting that Denmark was planning to use the upcoming Danish EU presidency to promote some of its plans in this regard. And the point is that the outcome of the reform plans actually had sort of set the agenda for this to be on. I mean, it's not just Denmark inventing this, because it is a part of the reform. It is simply stipulated in the asylum procedure regulation, Article 60 something, 7 or 9 or whatever. The safe third country, for that concept of safe third countries, are to be re-evaluated, and the Commission is requested to, as appropriate, to propose targeted amendments, something like that is the wording, which means that it was a part of the compromise that there would be so far no fundamental changes adopted in the EU approach to safe third countries. Most importantly, the connection requirement has been maintained, which would make the Rwanda plan impossible, unfeasible simply. But I guess the compromise was that, okay, we retain the connection requirement so far, but then we are going to open the debate again after 1 year. And interestingly, 1 day after the council ministers had made the final approval of this legislative package under the pact, including the asylum procedure regulation, that is on the 15th of May, Denmark and 14 other member states sent this letter, to which reference was already made, which is essentially trying to not only to talk about revising the regulation, but more generally trying to push for these third country solutions. I'm not an expert in international relations, so I can't tell whether it's a wise diplomatic timing, but at least it shows that for domestic purposes and for attempt to set agendas, it is really sort of keeping the pot boiling or whatever. I mean, just 1 day after we all thought this was now a done deal, then they start pushing again for renewed negotiations. Finally, one thing about narratives. I think it has been interesting to follow the Danish debates because it has all been framed in a kind of humanitarian narrative. Denmark has argued that this would altogether be in full compliance with the Refugee Convention and what have we, international obligations, which is debatable, I would say, to say the least. But this formal compatibility has been accompanied by a humanitarian agenda that we should stop people from being sort of forced into the services of the smugglers. We should stop or break the smugglers' business model. Some would ask who actually are forcing people into the smugglers' services. Some would say that it is restrictions created by countries of destination in the first place. That's another agenda. But it's just interesting from a Danish domestic perspective that the rhetoric has been to say this is a humanitarian approach. We need to save these poor people. And the context is still, in Danish politics at least, also to combine it with a zero asylum policy. We essentially don't want asylum seekers in Denmark. So that's an interesting divergency of the narratives, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and please give a round of applause to all our panelists. So I now have the somewhat hard task of trying to pull some red threads across this, and I'm going to abuse it a little bit by simply asking questions I really want answered. And I guess what we hear initially, in a sense, is that the idea of talking about domino effects may be partly correct, not entirely, but there are some kind of interesting kind of interlinkages, and also then that the timeline yet is still very, very different between different countries. Yeah, so we've heard about the Danish shift in 2001. We can talk about Norwegian shift in, was it 7 or 8, and 2015 pretty much across all countries, and then more recent things in Sweden and in Norway in 2002, and just the new Finnish government. So there's some sort of weird things, kind of like we're still out of sync but maybe kind of moving in similar directions. Now, all of you picked up on the word paradigm shift, and it's sort of maybe to an extent where I was sort of saying, well, should we even have included this in the subtitle of the seminar? I mean, so I think that also at the level of politics and Nordic states talking about immigration policy, there might be a little bit of conceptual inflation in the use of the term paradigm shift. I'm personally on the belief that I think we've only seen one paradigm shift in my lifetime on immigration policy. It's probably come back to the Cold War. And I simply sort of push this, well, I mean, so is it, when Nordic policymakers actively talk about paradigm shift, is it substantive? Is it something that we would really, that merits that type of word? Am I wrong here? And perhaps also, I mean, and this comes particularly to some of the remarks that were on the very current things. I mean, is there any signs that we are on the cusp of a paradigm shift? I mean, I thought that, or I did think that we might have seen something of a paradigm shift. I thought we may, I can't speak English right now, but that it would have been a possibility that there would have been some kind of paradigm shift in the aftermath of 2015. And I'm now personally perhaps of the opinion that it didn't happen. But are there still signs of sort of some things kind of brewing? And if so, what kind of shape might that take? I don't know who wants to start. Maybe someone from the side. Sarah?
Yeah, I think this is also relates to domestic policy a lot, because I think migration is so politicized in all Nordic countries that, for example, in 2015 there was a Finnish government with the Finns party was in the government, but they had a very fresh government program when the started the refugee crisis in the autumn. So they didn't make that some substantive changes because they already had the agreed on the government program, and some of the changes that were made, they were then reversed by the following government. So I think it's mostly about, at least when I look at the changes in the Nordic countries, it relates to the, like, domestic policy, which parties are in the government and what they want to do, or which support the government, like in the case of Sweden. So the external events don't necessarily impact that much. Yeah, of course, the instrumentalization has been something that has created new demands for new measures, but like in general, it seems that it's more about this political debate and what the parties promise to their voters.
Yeah, I can. I think there has definitely been a paradigm shift in the way Sweden wants to be perceived, both internally for internal policies and externally, sending the message, don't come to Sweden. So that, I think, you can label as a paradigm shift. And also when it comes to the attitude in the way politicians speak about asylum seekers in Sweden. But I mean, there's still support for the right to asylum. That's in the TIIS agreement too. And when it comes to this adaptation of Swedish legislation to the minimum standard of EU law, I mean, it started already in 2015. They said, okay, EU minimum standard, but then mainly looking at the qualifications directive and the family reunification directive. And now the TIIS agreement again says, okay, EU minimum level, but then sort of looking at all aspects, really. But since the TIIS agreement, the pact has been adopted, which puts that concept in a different light, and there's less room nationally, with more of the common European asylum system being managed through regulations than directives. It's Sweden will just have to stick with that.
I mean, maybe turning to the other side here. I mean, there's also this point where, okay, as we all move into the same policy space and adopt these types of indirect or national-based deterrence policies, I mean, what are the chances that this is going to be effective? Yeah, I mean, presumably lots of this works on a kind of zero-sum logic that everybody does the same. You kind of annul the relative effects, or am I missing something here?
Just to comment on I'll comment on that shortly. Just wanted to say that I thought hygge was the only word that Danes were kind of exporting, but now we're exporting the paradigm shift word. So I'm a bit surprised by that. And I think that I thought back to Thomas Kuhn and his history of science and how he describes a paradigm shift. And it's very strict. It means that the old solutions don't work. They don't explain the world. And I think but to some extent that's been true in a few of these cases, but not in where you need new people, new ways of thinking completely, and new solutions, new questions. But in Norway, we haven't used that word. We don't use it in politics either in this field. So that's interesting, maybe. But does it? Do we push? Repeat. Sorry for the last question. You said that.
I mean, so what are the effects? I mean, are there any sort of significant outlook for changing something with this sort of direction that we are seeing, and these in the commonalities around deterrent policies?
Yeah, I think that there is a belief that deterrence works, and there's a logic there where it's a fear of holding back, and you don't. I mean, sometimes when I talk about this, I talk about the politicians, the responsible politicians, sitting in front of a dashboard, trying to control migration and manage migration by pulling levers and turning dials. The problem is that they don't really know how, and the dials being all the different restrictions with regard to integration, to processing, to acceptance rates, to all of this, to stopping people before they come to the border, but they don't know how the different levers or dials work. So when they get panicked, they just turn everything because they just don't know which one works in what way. And we have had a few of those occasions. But sometimes they turn a little bit on one and they see an effect. So what we see now, for example, which is a quite clear example, I think, last fall in Norway with regard to Ukrainian refugees, just having two press conferences from the politicians saying we might start reducing the rights and making it a bit tougher for Ukrainians coming to Norway. And you see a fall in the numbers quite, rapidly, like within the same week. Because the information is spread in certain systems. But what we found earlier is that type of, one dial turned, one effect out there in flows of migration, that may work. So that may work sometimes in certain situations for certain groups, but it's a very fine-tuned system, and it's not enough understanding of this. So the safest thing for politicians, if the numbers increase, which is it turns to this again, the struggle for control or the loss of control, the fear of loss of control means that they start turning too many levers and they have no idea of the effects. But they want to be seen as doing something, and then they'll do that. But I mean, the deal with Turkey, for example, didn't have an effect because that's unlike the left politicians, the left side of the politics will say, doesn't matter what we do with our borders, what Europe does, or the signals that are sent. It won't affect migration anyway. People will always find a way. I don't think that's right. I think that's too that lacks nuance, and the deal with Turkey is an example of that, where we can get countries buffering and helping and helping the politicians attaining their goal of getting control and to manage migration. Lots of downsides and lots of but. So the pure dynamics, I think that some of these levers do work, and but it's not sufficiently understood.
Thanks a lot. We'll come back to then the unintended consequence, but first, Jens.
Yeah, two observations. One is about the Ukrainians. They are an interesting example of loss of control in the sense that they were entitled to arrive. They didn't have to seek the services of smugglers because they were all exempt of almost all of them were exempt of visa requirements. So they could freely enter all Schengen countries. They could freely move around. And that's, of course, probably one of the reasons why the EU so rapidly adopted the temporary protection solutions, because they were here or they would come anyway. And that also means, since they can move freely around, they can make sort of unfettered calculations of where it is most opportune to be, so to say. Of course, there are many factors in play here that can be cultural or family links and so on, but still, I mean, such sort of reductions of rights may be able to actually impact movements more directly, because there are no smugglers sort of in between. My second observation was about the term of paradigm shift. I could think of 3 paradigm shifts in Danish asylum and immigration policy, and I wouldn't actually point to the 2019 one. I would say that the new narrative in the early 2000s was one, in fact. The introduction of temporary protection status with limited rights and significantly increased possibilities to revoke protection in 2015 was the second. And the third one is what has not happened yet, but the outsourcing plans, of course. And now I must try to limit the risk of being accused of academic snobism, so I won't say names here. But if you remember who actually introduced the term paradigm shift in Danish politics, I'm not quite sure that the person in question was really aware of sort of invoking Thomas Kuhn. And there must be some spin doctors in other parties who somehow regret that they didn't invent it or didn't invoke the fame of this, because it was the Danish People's Party which started proposing a paradigm shift, first in connection with the state budget negotiations for 2018, that was at the end of 2017, and then they came back a year later, and I guess the legislation was prepared altogether. But still, it was this political party who sort of got the fame of proposing a paradigm shift. In fact, the current prime minister should rather have tried to claim fame for that, because it was she, as a Minister of Justice in 2014-15, who actually made the most important icebreaker towards what we today consider the paradigm shift. So it is quite interesting how agenda setting can be quite incidental.
Thank you for that. I mean, so picking up on the Ukraine threat and maybe sort of pushing that on, so obviously Norway has received remarkably higher numbers of Ukrainians than some of the other Nordic countries. But still, I mean, a lot of this whole deterrent logic has been built around this sort of assumption that the Nordic welfare states would just be amazing magnets for everyone wanted to go. I think it was the philosopher Slavoj Žižek that wrote an essay in 2015 in the London Review of Books saying, well, of course we need to stop people in their tracks and have hard border control, because otherwise everybody would go to Norway. Now we know that exactly 80,000 went to Norway, but the large numbers of Ukrainians, of course, reside completely different places. Yeah, which sort of maybe suggests something about sort of fundamental lack of underpinnings in terms of the way we design policy in this area. And it brings me to another sort of tension that I think several of you brought up as well, which is the sense that what we do in the sort of space around deterrence tends to take up a lot of the political attention, but there is maybe a reverse picture where in some situations we want to actively attract newcomers. You mentioned it in terms of the labor policies. Sala, you've been working a lot on this also in terms of labor migration, free movement, etc. And I mean, at least in the Danish papers, we've had a lot of stories about it seems as if Danish politicians are suddenly becoming aware of what demographers have been telling them for about 20 years about kind of like falling birth rates. And it's suddenly an issue. And nobody wants to say what needs to be said, namely that it's going to mean that we're going to need much more labor immigration. So maybe other forms of immigration. And so I wanted to push this side of the equation so we don't sort of get stuck in only talking about asylum seekers or irregular migration. So what is this outlook in the other Nordic countries, and what might it mean also in terms of kind of forward-looking Nordic? I mean, we are all welfare states. So, I mean, the whole welfare premise, just as you can be afraid that it's not going to be tenable if too many people come in, that's not the right people. It's certainly also going to be non-tenable if we lack people in kind of working age. And the Ukrainians are maybe one example in sort of weird middle position. I don't know who wants to start. Martin?
Sure. Yeah, first just commenting on the deterrence thing very briefly, and that if crossing the Mediterranean in substandard boats isn't a deterrent enough, then I don't think you should be overly confident that details in the law, temporary residence permits, or you will be put through border procedure will be have a very strong effect as a deterrent. When it comes to labor immigration, Sweden in 2008 introduced what was described as the world's most generous labor immigration policy. And basically, if an employer wanted to hire someone, then there was a need. You know, let's move away from the state deciding who should come. It's up to the employer. If the employer sees a need, then there is a need. And that was really like a flagship reform of the conservative government at the time, center-right government, and now that is being pulled back, primarily in the sense that the income levels that you must reach have been increased significantly, and I believe now the government tries to balance, because they still want to attract the highly skilled workers, but not more lower skilled workers, whereas we also see a deficit in people available to take lower income jobs. So it's a tricky situation for the government to balance on, and a bit of mixed messages.
Jens, I mean, I know that the Danish, of course, Denmark has also introduced these very special schemes for labor migrants, erhvervsordninger. And I mean, one of the things that the industry is complaining about is that basically the agency, SIRI, who handles the caseload here, that they don't have enough, they fail to attract enough employees to process these. So I think in some of them, there's been like year-long waiting times to have some of these processed. So I mean, from a Danish perspective, are you seeing any kind of breaks in this area with the kind of more recent Danish debate that might change the situation in Denmark?
We know that we have a push for lowering the salary limits in order to be able to attract labor migrants at a lower level of payment than the current limits. I think today the limit is generally around 400,000 Danish kroner a year, and certain segments of employer organizations want to have it reduced, and that's a very highly sort of politicized issue, because both, of course, the trade union movement, but also actually some of the right-wing parties who are anti-immigration are also concerned over a kind of risk of social dumping, you could say, to have low-paid labor come in and compete. So that's an ongoing debate, I think. There has been a little bit of adjustment already, but I think it's certainly not a closed issue. But I think somehow this also illustrates how politics, high politics at domestic level, are sometimes sort of preventing rational discourses. In recent days, we have seen a rather strange discussion, as far as I have been able to follow it, in the run-up to the European Parliament elections, where some politicians are accusing other politicians of being a little bit open towards the idea of maybe somehow joining parts of the pact from which we are outside to begin with, in order to enable some kind of resettlement or relocation of refugees. And it is strange, I think, that this, I mean, which is then sort of really being used as a kind of scapegoating, that any idea of doing so is just almost betrayal of national interest or close to that. But in fact, I would wonder why there is not a much more sort of creative or constructive approach, which could even be an advantage in diplomatic terms for Denmark and other states, also at the UN level, to say, okay, we somehow agreed to the Global Compact on refugees 5.5 years ago, which in fact encourages alternative pathways, including resettlement is an old one actually, but then labor migration, student migration, and so on. And why not try to combine that with these sort of more rationally calculated interests of labor migration? Because that could be a way. I mean, we know from old immigration countries that it is possible to pretend to be humanitarian, but at the same time really serve your self-interest by picking the best and the brightest, so to say, under such schemes. That would be the rational interest. Now I'm going beyond my legal expertise, so I'm just speculating here.
So, do you want me to comment on Norwegian? Sorry,
Yes,
no,
yeah,
I'll
because
wait.
I have
Thank
an
you.
extra question for you, but I want to take this to you, Sila, yeah? Because, I mean, you've been working specifically in this area for a long time. We've had Nordic rules, we now have EU rules, etc. And, I mean, Finland is such an interesting case in this connection, as you're now taking this step towards much more restrictive policies on the asylum, family unification side, at a time where you presumably also need labour.
Yes, and I think this has been quite tricky for the current government because, the Prime Minister's party is the National Coalition Party, which is like right-wing, centre-right party, which is supported by the employers' organizations, and they want labour migration, obviously. But then they have the second largest government party is the Finns party, who wouldn't, well, at least they say that they would want labour migration from Europe, or the EU, which is obviously quite tricky, as all EU countries need labour force, so it's quite difficult to attract those. So I think there is this kind of tension that on one hand the government is promoting labour migration, and they have these specific countries that they are attracting, but then on the other hand they are restricting. They actually raise the income limits, unlike in some other countries. So it's harder to attain workers for the kind of lower paid jobs. So there is this. I'm really looking at the free movement discourse that, and there you kind of, the EU is kind of promoting this, that people migrate for work, or move to other countries to work, and for these economic reasons to get a better life for themselves. But in this asylum discussion, there you kind of like accuse people of wanting or coming for economic reasons and kind of exploiting the system. So there is this kind of interesting tension where you don't really connect these two, even though there could be possibilities to use this.
And this brings me to you, because you said something in your opening remarks that I thought was really interesting. This sort of weird thing about sort of deterrence seeming to coexist. It sounded almost as you thought seamlessly with then the special measures towards the Ukrainian. And I mean, in my teaching on kind of like refugee and migration studies, it was always told that, you know, there will always be these sort of like interconnections between these two sides. Yeah. So, I mean, the deterrence policies emerged at a time where we no longer needed the generous labor schemes, or had those that was shut down in the 70s. Then there was the change of politics, etc. But now we have this situation. I mean, is it a generally new thing that you can kind of like maintain these two tracks? I mean, what collapses in the middle, or is it a transitional period?
I mean, it's definitely it will probably be a transitional period, but I think it's interesting that it's very difficult to communicate in this field. So if you ask the Norwegian Minister of Justice about all these things three things at the same time, that is solidarity towards self-evident solidarity towards the Ukrainians, according to Norwegian politics, and then deterrence towards asylum seekers, and then the need for labor immigration. At the same time, she won't come to the press conference, I think. She'll have to have three separate ones, because it's very difficult to talk about these three things, because there are three tracks, three sets of, if not logics, three ways of thinking, three basic values being expressed, etc. Whereas, you know, the deterrence is leaning on one foot, the control foot, and then the Ukrainians are on the solidarity foot and the humanitarian foot, and then the labor migration is on the rational. It's the head talking. We do need these people, and in Norway we have been served by other EU and EEA countries so far, Lithuania and Poland. As the majority two countries, we have more than 100,000 from each country in Norway. But as situations change, also in their home countries, we see the need for third countries labor immigration to Norway, and I think that's a tough discussion to have, because you have to find countries traditionally that do not send asylum seekers because you don't want to mix the two tracks, and it's not. I think it's not very well developed. And at the basic, it's a difficult thing for Norway when we're not defined ourselves as an immigration country or like an active immigration country. We are not. We're more immigration control country, which has served us. Some will say has served us well. But it makes it difficult when we can't set up schemes like the UK or the US do. They have their own situation, of course, but they could be an active like Canada. You could say, okay, then you can start selecting. If you say we're an immigration country de facto, but also in politics, and then we can start selecting. We want this is for the humanitarian track. We want to limit those. We want, we have a limited capacity. We want these highly qualified labor migrants from these certain countries. You can start talking like that, but it's difficult to be very strategic for attracting labor migrants, I think, if you're at the same time deterring people from the same region, and then you get into trouble and have to have 3 press conferences.
So cognitive dissonance at the political level, fantastic.
Yes, it's not a rational. It's not rational. Politics is not rational.
So I'm not hearing any of you say that the sort of need for labor migration would necessarily prompt a new turn. I mean, from the liberal frontrunner to the restrictionist north. I mean, am I right to hear that you're kind of thinking that it's going to be somewhere in the middle, or anyone care to disagree? We don't know yet. Okay, I think I'll hold a little bit the cross prompting here and open up to the floor, so we get some questions from the room. And please state your question and by beginning by saying your name or affiliation if you come from somewhere, and preferably to whom you'd like to ask the question, if someone in particular. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Hans Lucht. I study migration here at DIIS. Thank you for coming together. It's really, really fascinating, and to hear the whole, it's such a great idea to have the Nordic kind of experience here, something we should do more at DIIS. I was wondering, looking into the EU election, here in Denmark there's been a lot of talk about Frontex, and almost every candidate suggest that we should use more money on Frontex and double their budgets and triple their manpower and so on. So Frontex seems to be, it's been an institution that's been engulfed in scandal over the last years, but they're immune to scandal in a Danish context. So I was wondering whether that's the same in the other Nordic countries, and whether there's also this admiration for Frontex that has been kind of involved in, illegal activities and corruption and so on, and still have a cloud of corruption hanging over them. And secondly, instrumentalization is a relatively new thing in migration politics, and especially Finland and Norway has been affected by it. So that could be interesting to hear your views on. It's also related to the new talk about migrants as hybrid weapons and migration as hybrid warfare, this kind of seeing migrants as collateral in a kind of war between Europe and its adversaries, typically authoritarian countries like Russia, Belarus, and so on. So what kind of pressure will this put on the Nordic countries, both in terms of politics, but also, I guess, in a legal sense? Thank you.
My suggestion would be that we just take a few questions, because if you each full answer every question, there will not be time for many questions. So I think we had a few over here, Noel and Ida.
Hello? You can hear me? Okay, right. I'm Noel Parker. I'm a retired member of the staff of the political science at the University of Copenhagen. Right. I'm struck by something that one of the things you said. I very much like the image of twiddling the knobs and controlling, and the politicians panicking because he can't control. Now, our societies are very used to having things out of their control, or things partially of their control, because they are liberal and they are capitalist market societies. So why is it that it's so different with migration than it is with controlling the labour market, or controlling the housing market, or putting up interest rates and putting them down? Why is there this intolerance of feeling our way with forces which are basically out of our control, but can be influenced. So that was my important point. Important point. Maybe not. Anyway, I had another remark. The expression spontaneous migration appeared in the Danish debate last year or the year before. Seems to have disappeared. And I speculate that spontaneous is quite a nice word. So the government's aspiration to discourage spontaneous migration.
You mean spontaneous asylum seekers, yeah?
Yeah, yes, sorry. Was deemed a bad thing because spontaneity, that's wonderful. Okay, that's my two comments.
Anita, and then I think we'll take it back to the panel.
Yeah, I'm a little bit interested in knowing. First of all, thank you a lot. I think this is really great. I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about the foreign policy agendas and comparing between the countries. In Denmark, I think it was in 2020, we got the migration ambassador, for example, or even before, that traveled around with a task force to different non-European countries trying to see whether there were openings for making migration deals. And how has that actually influenced both where we are today in Denmark, but also do you see similar bureaucratic setups in the other Nordic countries? Are you also inspired in that way? I think that could be interesting to know more about. Thank you.
Perfect. So Frontex instrumentalization, why migration so different, what's wrong with being spontaneous, and how about the foreign policy? My suggestion is that you pick one or two questions each and sort of give an answer a bit selectively as you like. Jens, you get to go first.
Okay, thank you. I guess the problem with spontaneous asylum seekers is precisely what Jan Paul explained, that they are beyond control. I mean, but of course it also reflects a kind of dichotomy in the Danish political debate, because the alternative would then be to go for resettlement. And while Denmark has been trying to prevent spontaneous arrivals, we have at the same time also frozen resettlement. And as I argued before, we have not really picked up on the UN idea from the Global Compact to try to elaborate complementary pathways, which would be another way of preventing spontaneous arrivals. To a certain extent at least. So I think simply that spontaneous is unwanted because it is beyond control, and then it is often labeled as unlawful. Maybe the better term would be irregular. So that would be my suggestion for that.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for very interesting questions. Let's start with the foreign policy one. Norway hasn't had missions traveling in order to establish third country processing deals, but we have certainly been active in making bilateral agreements on readmission and return. And we've been studying that in the Norway and the EU corridor to Ethiopia in particular as an example, and why it's so difficult to return people to Ethiopia for Norwegian government and for the EU governments. And that reveals, we think, a power switch, which happens when you come to the question of return. So whereas we have the power when the receiving countries in Europe have the power of rejecting applications, when it comes to return, the countries of origin have to agree, and they hold the key to that process. And there's of course, in those countries, in certain countries in Africa, there's a general downturn in the value of let's say Western or the self-evident kind of superior position of the Western governments and Western influence. So we're working against a little bit of a resistance there. But I think the role of foreign policy is difficult because they also work with development aid in the same regions as we work with migration management. And there's a mix of interests, also humanitarian aid, of course, and cooperating with these countries in all different respects, in trade, security in the region, anti-extremism, etc. So it brings into the whole portfolio of foreign policies, foreign policies goals. And mixing, and often at least in Norway, the Ministry of Justice and end up being kind of maybe they struggle to get their voice heard and their interests of getting return and securing kind of their special interests of control policies, because the other interests of the foreign policy in broad can trump that in the individual case, but because that's always there are two different mandates of the receiving country, and these have to find a way out. Maybe I can come back to some more. What? Sorry.
I need to answer the knob question. Why is it so hard to control the?
Why can't they accept that the control? It's called controlled policies. So if they're out of control and their mandate is to control, it looks very badly in the public, and there's lots of political capital and political risks involved, and it's very immediate. You see sometimes governments fall just for a couple of cases. A family that can be either way. It could be being too strict or too loose, but they do not. If they see their numbers rise relative to neighboring countries for one country group, they feel that they have to make measures. They feel like the system will be. It can appear that the system is exploited, and that so that is. We had that with, for example, Chechen refugees back in during the two wars of the conflicts. Norway suddenly the numbers of Chechens coming to Norwegian border applying for asylum, rose through the roof compared to neighboring countries, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, etc. And that is just simply not possible for Norwegian government to accept. Because everything else is seemed to be the same, and then this goes out, so they have to respond because they will feel that the system is being exploited somehow. Smugglers are favoring this country, so they try to adjust. They try to turn a lot of knobs to make that go down again. So it's a highly political risk area, which means that so they can accept very little to be perceived not to have control. But it's a very good question, because they may, if it's not noticed by anyone, they can do it. It's a system that's so underneath this politics, you have policies, and you can accept people, for example, being accepted. So we see this in practice, even though you're very strict towards people without a permit, living for a long time in our countries without getting, their permits. They're just waiting to be deported, for example. If no one asks, they will kind of simmer into the system and be legalized, after 50. But if you make like these people should be really legalized, they should get their permits. They've been here for 15 years, no chance they won't get it. So we have like a rationality underneath the politics. But if you kind of call it out and make demonstrations in front of a parliament, you may hurt the case, because then it's very difficult politically to say yes to that group, because it will appear that you're pressured into accepting a group, and then you get the whole. Sorry, I'm just talking here.
Jens, you just want to briefly come in on this, and then we'll continue the round.
Yeah, we saw a bit of the same thing with Eritrean asylum seekers in Denmark in 2014, which also caused a kind of panic from the then Minister of Justice, and which was followed up by some not so elegant initiatives by the Immigration Service, to say the least. As regards the scaredness about spontaneousness, I think again we have two different levels of the discourse here. Now I'm again leaving my legal comfort zone. I think underneath is also an outright xenophobia, or at least a political strategy to go for zero asylum, as the Danish Prime Minister has officially stated at a certain point. Again, illustrated by the fact that we could at least have some resettlement or other complementary pathways becoming implemented. But now it seems that even opening the debate that we might do a little bit about the EU pact to just make it possible to adhere to those very flexible solutions, that in itself has been a kind of political blind alley in Danish politics these days. At least there is a kind of fear of being soft in any way, even the most rational ones.
Stella?
Yeah, and I think all of this also relates to the securitization of migration. So, for example, why you provide resources for Frontex and why it is politically safe for to promote that. You know, that also at the EU level, it has been that countries have provided more resources, more authority, more powers for Frontex, and it's been quite easy to agree on that because that doesn't cause so much, and perhaps it brings some reassurance. The idea of having some EU border guards at the border, even though we all know that has nothing to do with the migration policy, and people cannot apply for asylum no matter how many border guards there are in the at the border, and then this also relates to the instrumentalization. Like in Finland, the discussion has been that this is not a migration issue. This is a security issue. That Russia is waging a war of aggression against Ukraine, and now it's importing people to the border. So this is not a migration. This is only about security, and I think also in this kind of foreign policy discussion that I think. There have been some inspiration also from Denmark and other countries in the Finnish government program, but I think it's mainly this kind of conditionality in return and readmission policy. So like they want to conditionalize this trade and other foreign policy for return and readmission, but it's not really like comprehensive, like having carrots and sticks, but it's mainly these sticks, so they may not be that effective. But yeah, thanks.
Martin?
Yeah, it was interesting to hear that Frontex appears to be a big topic in relation to the EU election here in Denmark, because in Sweden it's, I don't know, people don't really know what Frontex is and haven't really heard of it. But from the political parties, many of them are very happy with the pact, and in the sense that, and their message is more control at EU's external borders equals fewer asylum seekers to Sweden. And when it comes to the solidarity mechanism in the pact, the signal from Sweden is that, well, we will pay ourselves out. And on the foreign policy agenda, well, deterrence-wise, there has been information campaigns from Sweden about the shift in policies in Sweden. And then also regarding foreign aid, there's a lot of focus on linking aid to returns, making countries take back people, and also some discussions about opening up for return hubs in some third country. So this is not for the processing of their asylum applications, but for rejected asylum seekers who cannot be returned to their country of origin, but to be returned to a return hub, some third country instead. But when it comes to the foreign policy agenda and the use of foreign aid, there's very little talk about the root causes and what actually makes people flee from their countries, and how can that be addressed. You don't hear much about that at all.
A two-finger intervention.
Very, very quickly, I just wanted to say on the Frontex, I think it's interesting that what European countries have agreed on is a strong outer border. And why is that possible? It's possible because then you don't blame the refugees or migrants coming irregularly, and you don't blame the receiving countries in Europe, but we can all agree on a common enemy, which is the smugglers and the managing that outer border. And that both on externalization and the fight against smuggling, we heard that on the migration seminar in Copenhagen a few weeks ago, at the big EU meeting here. It was called Migration Copenhagen. What is it called?
Copenhagen Migration Conference. Yeah.
So I think that kind of explains it, but it hasn't been an issue in Norway either. We contribute, we're part of it, even though we're not EU members, but it's not discussed.
Thanks. We'll do another round of questions, and I've got 3 in list. It's here, and down there. Maybe we'll do 4 then. But I think maybe you should start over here. Is that all right?
Yeah, my name is Mishra. I wanted to ask that just today, before coming here, I saw in the news that from zero, Geert Wilders' party has probably scored like 7 seats in the European Parliament. So my first question is, like, if there is a landslide or a huge victory for the right-wing parties, how would that impact, and what kind of measures would then be the next implemented in the line? And the second question is about these highly skilled workers. I mean, I have seen that. I come from India, and a lot of highly skilled workers have been coming to Denmark and Sweden also, I guess, from India. But they seem to be very worried about this. When you ask them, or I talk to them, they say, well, maybe Scandinavia has got another 10 years before this also becomes a destabilized region with the war. So how is the other geopolitical stuff going to impact? Because people are attracted here because they don't want to return. They want to settle and have a good life. But if it's like 10 years perspective, maybe then there will be other regions of the world that will attract these highly skilled migrants. What do you have to say about that? Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. And then in the front here.
Thank you so much for the discussion. My name is Barbara Rijks. I'm the head of the Nordic liaison here for IOM in the UN City, and I hear a lot of the same discussion traveling around the Nordic countries. No, I just maybe 2 points. I think one is really the importance for all of us working in the migration field to kind of drill down around the numbers and facts and not assume things to be the case. Like as interesting this discussion around control, because specifically, let's say on asylum applications, I think the vast majority of the asylums comes from Venezuela, for instance, is my understanding, you know, coming through legal channels through Europe, visa-free regimes. The irregular migrants arriving maybe at the shores, they actually stay in Europe because they get jobs. You know, there's a huge demand for labor migrants in all kinds of agriculture and stuff like that. So they will keep coming regardless. I think the huge impact of intra-EU mobility is very important. I come from the Netherlands, where I think there is a housing crisis, not necessarily because of migrants or coming from asylum seekers, but because there is a huge need for workers, like there is here as well. So I think really around integration, myth busters, we need to really drill down when we talk about control. Is it entry, or is it the feeling that often what's happening, I think when I visit Sweden quite a lot, that they say we have 20,000 migrants and they need to leave, but we don't know where they are. So is that, so I think we have to be careful also kind of with the narrative around control. And then that was my first point. And the second point was just, I think where I'm glad the second part of the discussion went that way. And I think this is really the key issue for the future, is this whole tension between this kind of deterrence and the need for labor in the countries. And now what we see when we talk to, let's say, the Danish industry or Copenhagen capacity, a lot of these companies, they all need labor, but let's say the deterrence narrative is actually scaring labor away from countries like Denmark that need them. And we see in the Netherlands with the recent elections, there's a big company that said to the politicians, if you don't allow me to hire the workers that I need, I'm going to move my headquarters to outside of the Netherlands. So I think that tension, I think, is really the key discussion that hopefully we can have more focus on.
And then in the back.
Hi, Will Jones, University of Copenhagen. I'm going to push back a little bit, if I may, to the question, the answers to Professor Parker's question about control. I wonder if we could think about control in the context of Jens's observation that it's very easy to deploy a humanitarian rationale for something that is manifestly not humanitarian, and the same could go for control rationales. There are countries historically which have very explicitly exchanged expanding the scale of asylum for control over it. So Australia's agreements in 1978, which work very successfully for 20 years, where they take huge numbers of asylum seekers, creating the modern multi-ethnic Australia we see today, in return for those countries preventing irregular asylum, right? And that only breaks down in the 1990s when the asylum seekers start becoming Muslim. as Jens has pointed out, no one in the Nordic region is going for that. No one is proposing anything like that at all. So in that context, I wonder if control is a euphemism, xenophobia is a euphemism, security is a euphemism. These are polite political ways of talking about a horror of brown Muslims. And we have got 90 minutes through a seminar without saying that. And I wonder if control here is not really what control is, right? Control is a code word for something much nastier.
Thanks a lot. Do we want to get the last question in from the back here? There are plenty more, but we'll take one more and then we'll take it back to the panel.
Thank you. My name is Natalia Rivas. I'm a visiting researcher here at DIIS. I just wanted to put a question, like it's a difficult and broad question about the historical roots of xenophobia in Nordic countries, because as a foreigner, I don't understand this point, these historical roots of xenophobia here, because if you check all the examples, it's very clear, you know, like for example, Southern Europe with you have all these the legacy of the authoritarian regimes that explains very well these legacies of heritage of xenophobia in these countries. Even you go to the British Empire in Brexit, and you see very well all these connections, no, with xenophobia. You go to France and you see Le Pen, and you see the connections with the historical Algeria and colonization, whatever, and you see very well the connections all the time. But as a foreigner, when I think about Nordic countries, I don't understand the historical roots of xenophobia here and the political expression of it. Thank you.
Hard questions. I'm not sure I understand the historical roots of xenophobia either, but I'm very much banking on my co-panelist making me wiser. Should we maybe begin in the reverse order this time? Do you want to kick off, Matt?
Yeah, difficult questions indeed. Well, starting with you, Will, I definitely think that you're spot on in many ways. We see in Sweden, the political narrative is very much about blurring the lines between immigration and criminality, and you see links between migration law and criminal law, pushing an agenda that an agenda of fear of people coming to Sweden. So it's very, very visible. There. I didn't really have time to gather my thoughts on the question here. Well, on the question of the European elections and if it's a big rise for far-right parties across the Union, I mean, we will see. It took quite some time to get the pact on migration and asylum in place. I mean, the first proposals were put forward in 2016, were negotiated for a couple of years, and then repackaged and launched as the pact. And then it took another couple of years to agree on that. I mean, if there's a big change, maybe the pact will be withdrawn, and we've heard that the safe third country concept is one of those things that will be reassessed after 1 year, and that is definitely something that I think can change if the far right parties do gain a lot of more seats in the parliament. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Yes, thank you for very excellent and tricky questions. I also think that this is, in the EV elections, we might see more discussion on this externalization. We know the EPP has, in their electoral manifesto, they have this aim of having some sort of externalization measure, although actually in Finland there has been some discussion that this is actually not their objective, but yeah, they've made some new approaches towards this, but I guess this is shared by many, and actually there was a poll this morning I read in Finland that 40% of the respondents in Finland they are in favor of this sort of shifting or transferring the asylum process in third countries. So there is quite a lot of support for that. So we'll see how the elections go, and about the relation between labor and asylum migration. So this is, I think, also a problem. Now we've already seen in Finland also that this, like, tightening the requirements for permanent residence and citizenship have kind of deterred also these highly skilled migrants from coming from Finland, and this whole like idea of making it harder for migrants in Finland to so it's not very easy to combine these objectives of limiting the humanitarian migration and increasing the labor migration, and I think indeed this is a question in the Nordic countries about this, like populist parties like feeding this fear of certain migrants.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Very quickly, it's interesting to be reminded that highly skilled immigrants are mobile and are actually migrants, so they can move on, and it's not self-evident that they will stay. I mean, they often do, because they bring their families, and they do find that the Nordic model may work for them as well. But it's a very, very important point, I think. And then I think with regard to the important important interplay between labor immigration and asylum immigration, or asylum seekers deterrence, it's interesting that our German colleague, did you notice that as well at the Copenhagen the migration, that the German colleague was the only one that mentioned this. That he started out talking about demographics and the need for people to come, and then he kind of went into the more restrictive section there. But he was the only one out of the maybe 8-10 EU countries taking the stage. So I think that was interesting. And then the tougher questions are about what we were. I mentioned the nexus or the interplay between migration policies or control policies and integration, but you could also say between diverse societies and integration processes and migration control. And that is, and then once you start talking about diversity and diversity effects and challenges and the upsides, of course, too, it is a very, we should have a separate meeting on this, but I think it's what we do. I could say very shortly is that we do survey experiments trying to find where the resistance is among the people that, for example, in Norway, who have restrictive attitudes towards immigration and immigrants from different countries, etc. And we do pose the tough questions. We do have a set of questions about the threats that some people experience with immigration, different, even including nationalities, degrees of religion, different types of religion, etc., trying to mix this up, trying to find where the resistance towards immigration kind of sits. Is it a gut reaction in the spine for national culture and threat to the national identity, etc., or is it more rational towards the threats towards the labor market, challenges, etc.? So we try to disentangle this. But what we do find, which may interest you, is that we find that because Islam comes out in these surveys as particularly kind of prominent, triggering resistance among some parts of the population. But what we do find out, if we ask, everything else equal, if we ask people if they are negative towards immigrants with a strong Muslim belief, we find that rate's very high. But if we ask them if they are negative to people with strong Christian Protestant beliefs, which is the majority of the religion in Norway, it also rates very high. So there's something about So it's something about we're trying to disentangle what about Islam is so everything else, equal, which means that we have to take out, color of skin, etc., and all that. So it's a difficult and associations with certain migration, immigration backgrounds, etc. It's very difficult to disentangle where the resistance among our populations sit. But I think it's very important work in order to understand, the resistance, and also the opposite. Of course, people are very positive towards immigration. Why? We try to disentangle that as well using methodology like survey experiments. But it's very important work, I think, to not just take, just to push, one side of the politics and the electorate. I mean, our governments are elected by our democracies. We have to remember that is even today, I think. So there's something there, but trying to understand the dynamics is very important. I'll stop there.
So Jens, the other panelist has very kindly left you with answering the question about the historical roots of Nordic xenophobia.
Wonderful. I'm not a historian and I'm not a socio-psychologist. Nonetheless, I'll just mention a couple of perspectives here. It is very much about fear, which again goes back to things getting out of control. And I think it's also in the modern realities of media and politics, it's difficult not to also to include, in addition to fear, also mongering, that simply fear is getting exploited very, very rapidly. And then let me try to be a bit historical. I remember that the German Hans Magnus Enzensberger in the 90s wrote a book, maybe it was termed Die große Wanderung, Den store Vandring in Danish, where he pointed to an interesting observation. It is not just otherness, but it is also poverty which makes migrant appear a threat, creating fear. And I think we have an interesting historical not parallel, but early example of that in Danish migration history. That is the Eastern European Jews who arrived here in, the late 1800s and early 1900s. They were poor and they were different. They were so poor that they were even a perceived problem by the quite well integrated, if not assimilated, wealthy Jews in Copenhagen, as far as I have understood. So they helped them to move on, secondary movement, if you want, in modern terms. And I mean, here we see a kind of, translating this into contemporary terms, that would be maybe not poverty only, but also maybe could be social benefit tourism or exploitation of welfare states and so on. And then, of course, the difference or the otherness in modern times is rather Muslims, who can then also cause fear because they can, at least in the more sort of stronger version of faith, they can very easily be sort of identified with terrorist threats. So that's at least a couple of factors causing fear and loss of control. And that was just a kind of layman observation from a lawyer, sorry.
A very well-read lawyer, thank you very much, Jens.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have time for just a few more questions in the last finishing round, so we've got one here. And we'll take, we take 3 short ones if you promise to keep it relatively brief.
Yeah, hi, I'm Morten Larsen from the Danish Ministry of Immigration and Integration. I was just wanting to comment on. I think the xenophobic question is definitely part of it, but I think you're missing part of the point. My daughter lives in Turkey, and they have exactly the same discussion in Turkey about the Syrian and Afghani refugees and migrants. My question would be. Do you see any sort of European discussion about the problems in Belgium maybe being discussed across in your countries? So you're not only talking about issues in Sweden or in Finland or in Norway or in Denmark, but we are also addressing problems that arise maybe in other European countries. Do you see like a rise of like a more like a European discussion of these issues? That's my question.
Then Andrea, right in front here.
Hi, I'm Andrea, PhD student at Mobile. I have a question about the common thread here, the paradigm shifts. And it's basically what happens when the Nordic countries are not in line when it comes to paradigm shifts, approaches to deterrence, approaches to control? Does it erode the relationship between the countries? What is the effect if you don't fall in line, if there's this not this domino effect? Thank you.
And then Sarah gets the final one.
Thank you. Also, very much in line with Andrea's question. I'm Sarah. I'm a postdoc at Mobile. Mostly for you, Sila, I think, with your comments about this reference to the Nordic level and the direct reference also to Denmark, I was wondering, maybe in the broader political debate also, how do they generally position themselves vis-a-vis like the other Nordic countries? And do they see their policy as front runners at times and other times more like as followers, as in the example you used? And, you know, I was also thinking about sometimes in Denmark, we see Sweden invoked as kind of like, you know, the scare example or like Swedish conditions. So sometimes there's this negative positions. And when do you see that? And would also be happy if any of you from Sweden and Norway would like to weigh in on this. You know, do you see these types of comparisons to the other Nordic countries change over time or used in different circumstances?
Thanks a lot. Should we start here? Jens, you get to go first this time. And it'll be good. Do you want to say something?
Oh, absolutely. On the Swedish conditions, do the Norwegian public debate refer to the other Nordic countries? Yes, we do in this field, and quite frequently, and particularly now, of course, with over the last year with the Swedish challenges with regard to gang crime and the segregation and the shift in Swedish politics and discussions on how could it take that long before on the national level you had started the discussion talking about the challenges related to immigration and certain aspects of immigration and integration. Whereas on the local level it's been discussed all and handled for the last 20 years, but then on the national level. So that's part of the discussion in Norway. And we refer to Denmark as a machine producing innovative or measures in sense of being restrictive in this field, in the field of immigration politics. Thanks.
Fantastic.
Yes, thank you. They were very good questions. I think I don't really know what the Nordicness is referring to, because I think Sweden is indeed in the Finnish discussion. There is discussion on whether Finland is on the Swedish path, or like where we're going in the same direction with regards to this gang criminality and so on. But I think like Nordic countries in general are a kind of a attractive reference group for the especially for the Finns party that is mostly discussing migration in Finland. So the kind of Nordicness is something positive, and I think the Danish model is perhaps the most attractive one. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks. I'll be super brief because I have a train to catch soon. Well, comparing with the alignment question regarding the alignment between Nordic countries, I think there's an increased risk of the so-called race to the bottom. When you see one country moving in a more restrictive direction, there's a fear of, okay, might we be perceived as being more generous, and would that mean that more people come here? It's a fear for that. And then comparisons with situations in different countries. I think it's natural that it's done between the Nordic countries. It's easy to relate for people to what's going on in the different countries. And going back a while, there was quite a lot of discussion in Sweden regarding motorcycle gangs in Denmark, and how can we avoid having that sort of development in Sweden. So it goes both ways, I guess. Okay, thanks.
And on that note, please join me in thanking all our panelists and DIIS for hosting and Ida Marie for introducing.